Hello, fine folks. So I am currently watching a making-of documentary for The Phantom Menace, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And I noticed something about the filmmaking thought process and methods that went into the making of The Phantom Menace. And I think it's sort of an issue. The issues with The Phantom Menace and the way it was made, I think, are sort of a more broad thing I'm noticing more recently. And that is a failure driven by the presumption of success. Because you see, George Lucas is making The Phantom Menace in this documentary. It's like the 1990s, and he's putting together his film. And I definitely see the way that he's talking to the people who are on the production team. I can see that there is this underlying assumption that, yes, I'm George Lucas, of course this is going to be excellent, everyone just do what I say and it'll all work out. Which, I think there's a place for that, but you got to realize that Star Wars, for, 20 years plus at this point, when The Phantom Menace came out, it had been a cultural phenomenon. Now it did wax and wane in popularity a little bit, but there wasn't a time when people didn't know what Star Wars was. It's this cultural juggernaut. And when you're at the helm of something that successful, it's really, really interesting to think about the responsibility that you feel for bringing something to life when you have not yet proved yourself versus bringing it to life after you've already proven yourself to be the king. And George Lucas, in many ways, was the king of this IP, but when he made his original three movies, yes, he directed the first one. He sort of shepherded the last two. Very much involved in those last two films. But he had a lot of other people who were working with him. He had a studio he was trying to contend with in the first one, and then he also had issues with, not being the main director, and that sort of, not necessarily being an issue, but sort of a back and forth of ideas there. And, when you're trying to prove yourself, I think you try harder. I think you have a much clearer vision of what people are going to think when you think you have the sword of Damocles hanging over you, I think. And, you also don't have that much of a voice that you have after you've proven yourself. So, for example, in the first film, Alec Guinness, Harrison Ford, if my understanding is correct, they rewrote a lot of their own dialogue because they wanted it to flow a little bit better. George Lucas is sort of infamous for writing this very wooden dialogue. Like, no, the line is, I must know what the prophecy says. Like, he's very particular about these very unnatural sounding lines. And when actors want to come through and make them sound a little bit more natural, I think it works better for the Star Wars universe because it, number one, helps the acting, but number two, it makes the world feel a lot more realistic. When George Lucas writes a line, but then you end up with Harrison Ford just saying, what the hell are you doing? That sounds more like something someone would say in that situation. And of course, I don't know what that original line was. But then you're going into The Phantom Menace. George Lucas is already the person that's expected to just spin gold at this point. And I'm watching the behind the scenes with everything, and no one is pushing back. No one is saying to him, George, I think this is not a good idea. We need to redo this. We need to do this differently. Everyone is just kind of being commanded by George. And I'm watching him with Jake Lloyd, who played Anakin Skywalker, which, as you know, unfortunately, received a lot of hate as a child actor, which absolutely no one deserves, and the guy should still be left alone, because at the end of the day, it is just a movie, and it was just a performance. But I think part of the reason why George Lucas kind of set him up for failure, in my opinion, was if you watch that movie, Jake Lloyd is saying all these lines, and they don't sound like a kid would talk. He would say things like, I'm a pilot, and someday I'm going to fly away from this place. Which, the sentiment is something a kid would say, but if I tell a child actor, just say this line the way you would say it, and the kid says, hey, I'm a pilot. I'm going to leave here someday. I'm going to go far away. Like, just something like that. Just something a little bit more natural. You know? I'm going to be far off someday. I'm not going to be staying around here. I'm not going to be sticking around. Something that's a little bit more like a kid would say. You know? I think that would have helped Jake Lloyd a lot. And especially if you listen to the line where he says, "You mentioned midichlorians. I've been wondering, what are midichlorians?" Instead of just saying something like, "Hey, what are midichlorians? You keep talking about midichlorians. What are those?" You know, I just think that would have helped. That change alone, I think would have helped this film so much. But because George Lucas was in charge, he was just like, no, everything has to be this way, which is why the prequels have this weird-sounding dialogue, and Anakin says, "If you're not with me, then you're my enemy." It's just the main thing. And I think the same problems were happening with the sequel trilogy. Now, I do believe the sequel trilogy is better than the prequel trilogy. People say that the prequel trilogy is better. I'm not going to argue with those people, but I will say I have a really hard time understanding that argument. I just, frankly, it's one of those things where I look at these films and I look at the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy, and I just don't really understand how anyone could say that the prequels are better given what the sequels are. But anyway, I'm looking at these films, and the sequels are a little bit better, in my opinion. The dialogue flows better. They took that criticism. But again, it was the same problem from a different point of view, kind of, because you didn't have George Lucas there as the king and the master, but Star Wars was the king and the master now. The Star Wars was the property that could not fail. And the studio went in with the arrogance of, oh, people are going to eat this up pretty much no matter what we do, as long as we make it recognizable. So we need a Han Solo type character, we need a cute droid, and there was no, like, organic from the ground up. I'm not saying there was no creativity, and there definitely was, but there was no, like, organic from the ground up. This is a story that needs to be told, and it just so happens to be in the Star Wars universe. Let's get someone who's going to make this as good as it can be. Everything in that first film was safe. Safe. Millennium Falcon and a new Death Star and destroying a planet, and we got to go on a run and blow it up. It's, you know, and we're going to have Han, and we're going to have Luke and Leia and Chewbacca and R2-D2 and C-3PO. It was from the ground up. It was just everything. And I know that, you know, R2 and Luke weren't really in that first movie all that much, but they were teased, right? That was the whole appeal. You're going to see these characters you like again. And then we went to the sequel to that, and yes, they did subvert a lot of expectations, and fans didn't like it, and what happened? The studio went, oh crap, and they went and tried to fix it, and it did not make it better. And it's just like, that was the problem the second time around. Star Wars was the thing, as a franchise, as a marketing opportunity, that was the main focus there. That was the thing that's like, well, if we just make it like people like it, and then in the middle when they had Rian Johnson doing it, they maybe branched out a little bit, but then when that didn't work immediately, they said, oh, no. So it's sort of this thing. What is the solution to this? I don't really know, but I think if I had to guess, I would say the solution is get someone who's trying to prove themselves. Get an up-and-coming director. The studios don't want to do that a lot of the time. Get someone who's made like a really, really good science fiction independent film who's a big fan of Star Wars. And I know that's kind of a big ask, but I'm pretty sure in all of Hollywood you could find someone like that. Someone who's made an indie sci-fi film that was inspired by Star Wars, is absolutely passionate about the project, and wants to get their name out there, wants to prove themselves. Get actors that want to do that too. Actors who are big fans of Star Wars, influenced by Star Wars, want to get their names out there. Maybe they've won some smaller awards for their performances in certain things. These are the kinds of things that studios need to be willing to do in order to try to get that gold again, because George Lucas wasn't selling Star Wars as a giant franchise that he wanted to make the maximum amount of money on. George Lucas was telling a story that he wanted to tell. He wanted to create a modern hero's journey for the 20th century. And he told it through Star Wars. And he didn't even think it was going to be all that successful. He said he expected it to make $10 to $15 million, and it's making $300 million at the box office, and definitely way more than that since with all the re-releases. So it's crazy. It's crazy to think about that. But I don't know. I'm just watching this, and I'm having such a clearer image in my mind watching this thinking, I can see what's happened here. I can see how this failed. Because the mindset's just all wrong. The mindset is, oh, of course this is going to be great. Of course it's going to be successful. Of course it's going to be legendary. It's Star Wars. How could it not be? And we got The Phantom Menace. And again, I'm not saying you should hate on any of the actors. Of course, don't do that. Don't hate on any of the actors that were in this film. It is just a movie. But if you're thinking about the mindset that leads to this kind of output and result, then I think that's absolutely what happened. But I want to know what you think about this. Let me know in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.